"You don't belong in a room like this." The words cut through the ballroom sharper than the crystal clinking beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. For a moment, the music seemed to fade. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. And every eye landed on one young woman standing beside a silver tray. Her name was Aaliyah Brooks, 24 years old, black, quiet, invisible to most of the people gathered inside the Grand Monarch Hotel in downtown Chicago. Tonight was supposed to be the celebration of the year. Ethan Whitmore, billionaire founder of Whitmore Capital, was hosting an extravagant engagement gala for nearly 400 guests. Politicians, investors, celebrities, the kind of people whose names appeared on magazine covers and whose decisions moved markets. The ballroom shimmered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from 30-foot ceilings. A string quartet played softly beneath warm amber lights. Waiters moved silently between tables covered in white linen and imported roses. Everything looked perfect, at least from a distance. Aaliyah adjusted her grip on the tray and continued walking. She had worked double shifts all week. Rent was due in 3 days. Her younger brother needed textbooks for community college. She was exhausted, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind that no paycheck could buy. Most guests never looked at her. Some barely acknowledged her existence. She was used to that. Invisible people learn how to survive in plain sight. Across the ballroom stood Victoria Sinclair, Ethan's fiancée, tall, elegant, flawlessly dressed in a designer gown worth more than most people's yearly salary. Cameras followed her wherever she went. Guests laughed at every joke she made. She moved through the room as if she owned it, and perhaps she believed she did. Victoria accepted compliments like they were owed to her. She smiled for photographs. She greeted investors. She basked in the attention. But beneath the polished image lived something colder. Something many people noticed but few dared mention. Victoria loved admiration, but she demanded obedience. The evening continued smoothly until one small accident changed everything. Aaliyah stepped toward a nearby table carrying sparkling water. As she carefully maneuvered around a crowded group of guests, someone suddenly stepped backward without looking. Aaliyah reacted instantly. She shifted her balance and prevented the tray from tipping. Not a single glass fell. Not a drop spilled. The crisis lasted less than a second. But Victoria saw it. And for reasons no one could fully understand, she decided that was enough. She walked across the ballroom. Her heels echoed against the marble floor. Guests instinctively stepped aside. The room seemed to sense something was wrong before a word was spoken. Aaliyah lowered her eyes respectfully. "I'm sorry if I was in the way, ma'am," she said calmly. Victoria stared at her. The silence stretched. Then came a sudden gesture. A sharp motion that stunned the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The music stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Hundreds of people stood motionless beneath the chandeliers. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. But what happened next was even more shocking. Aaliyah did not argue. She did not cry. She did not run. She slowly lifted her eyes and looked directly at Victoria. There was no anger there. No fear. Only a quiet certainty that seemed completely out of place. And somewhere across the ballroom, Ethan Whitmore felt something he had not expected to feel all night. Unease. Because in that single moment, it suddenly felt as though Victoria had made a mistake that would change far more than the rest of the evening. Aaliyah Brooks stood perfectly still as whispers spread across the ballroom like a sudden wind moving through tall grass. Nobody seemed to know what to say. The investors looked uncomfortable. The celebrities avoided eye contact. Even the hotel staff froze in place, unsure whether to continue working or disappear into the background. The silence felt heavier than the music ever had. Victoria Sinclair slowly turned away as though nothing unusual had happened. She adjusted a bracelet on her wrist and offered a confident smile to a nearby group of guests. To her, the moment was already over. To everyone else, it had just begun. Ethan Whitmore remained where he was. Something about Aaliyah's reaction refused to leave his mind. He had spent years reading people. Billion-dollar negotiations depended on understanding fear, confidence, ambition, and deception. Yet the expression on Aaliyah's face did not fit any category he knew. Most people would have reacted emotionally. Most people would have walked away. Aaliyah simply picked up a folded napkin from a nearby table, straightened her uniform, and returned to work. That was what unsettled him. Because it was not weakness. It was control. Hours earlier, before the guests arrived and before the ballroom filled with laughter and expensive perfume, Aaliyah had started her day in a very different world. Her apartment sat on the third floor of an aging brick building on the south side of Chicago. The elevator had not worked in months. The kitchen sink leaked. The heating system made strange noises every winter. Yet every morning, she woke up before sunrise and faced the day without complaint. At 6 o'clock that morning, she had prepared breakfast for her younger brother Marcus before heading to her first job. Marcus was 19 years old and studying engineering at a local community college. His textbooks cost more than they should. His dreams were larger than their circumstances. Aaliyah worked tirelessly to make sure those dreams stayed alive. She never talked about sacrifice. She simply lived it. Friends often asked why she never complained. The answer was simple. Complaining never paid bills. Complaining never solved problems. So she focused on moving forward one day at a time. What nobody at the gala knew was that Aaliyah had once imagined a very different future. Years ago, she had earned admission into one of the most respected business programs in Illinois. Professors praised her analytical skills. Classmates sought her advice. Her future looked bright. Then life changed. Medical bills, family emergencies, responsibilities that arrived without warning. One difficult decision became another. Eventually, education gave way to survival. Yet she never lost her curiosity. She never stopped reading, never stopped learning, never stopped believing that knowledge mattered. Back inside the ballroom, guests continued whispering about what they had witnessed. Some quietly criticized Victoria. Others defended her. But the conversation kept returning to one question. Why had Aaliyah remained so calm? Across the room, Ethan watched her move between tables with the same professionalism she had displayed all evening. Then he noticed something unusual. Near one of the investor tables, a group of executives were discussing a problem involving a pending acquisition. Their voices were low, their expressions tense. Aaliyah passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water. For only a second, she glanced toward a stack of documents resting beside them. Then she kept walking. Nobody noticed her brief look. Nobody except Ethan. And for reasons he could not explain, he suddenly felt that the young woman everyone had overlooked might be hiding a story far bigger than anyone in that room could imagine. Victoria Sinclair had spent most of her life believing that confidence and control were the same thing. They were not. Confidence earned respect. Control demanded it. And for years, very few people had challenged her enough to learn the difference. As the evening continued, she moved through the ballroom greeting guests, accepting compliments, and posing for photographs beside Ethan Whitmore. On the surface, everything looked flawless. The cameras still flashed. The investors still smiled. The champagne still flowed. Yet beneath the polished exterior, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations became quieter whenever she approached. Eyes lingered a little longer than before. People remembered what they had witnessed. And whether they admitted it or not, they were judging her. Victoria noticed it. She simply refused to acknowledge it. Across the room, Ethan remained distracted. His attention kept returning to Aaliyah Brooks. She moved efficiently between tables, collecting empty glasses and replacing plates as though nothing unusual had happened. Most people would have gone home. Most people would have asked to leave. Yet she remained professional. That bothered him more than anger would have. Meanwhile, near the far end of the ballroom, a private group of executives gathered around a table covered with financial documents. Their expressions grew increasingly tense. The acquisition they had spent months negotiating was encountering unexpected complications. Numbers did not align. Deadlines were approaching. Investors were demanding answers. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. Voices remained low, but concern spread through the group like a crack forming beneath glass. Aaliyah noticed it immediately. Years of working in luxury venues had taught her how to read rooms. Wealthy people often revealed more through body language than words. She could see frustration in their posture, anxiety in their expressions, urgency in the way pages were being turned. As she delivered sparkling water, a familiar phrase reached her ears. She paused for only a fraction of a second. Asset transfer schedule. Her eyes shifted briefly toward a document resting near the edge of the table. Then she continued walking. But something felt wrong. Very wrong. The numbers she had glimpsed did not match the discussion she overheard. It was only a moment, a quick glance. Yet her mind immediately began connecting pieces. Old habits returned. The same analytical instincts that once impressed professors years earlier quietly came alive again. Across the ballroom, Ethan noticed her expression change. It was subtle, almost invisible, but for the first time all evening, Aaliyah looked concerned. Not embarrassed, not intimidated, concerned, as if she had seen something nobody else had. Several minutes later, the executive group became visibly frustrated. One attorney closed a folder with a sigh. Another executive rubbed his forehead. The tension was growing. Nearby guests began noticing. Investors exchanged nervous looks. A deal that important could affect countless people. Then something unexpected happened. Aaliyah passed the table once more. Her pace slowed slightly. Her eyes moved toward a specific page. And before she could stop herself, a quiet thought escaped her lips. That schedule is attached to the wrong valuation model. Nobody was supposed to hear it, but someone did. The attorney closest to her looked up immediately. So did two executives. The conversation stopped. Chairs fell silent. Aaliyah froze. She had not intended to speak. Yet the words were already hanging in the air. And suddenly, for the second time that evening, every important person at that table was looking directly at the waitress they had barely noticed before. The attorney stared at Aaliyah for several seconds before speaking. His expression carried the kind of disbelief usually reserved for impossible situations. Around the table, executives exchanged confused glances. One investor quietly lowered his glass. Another folded his arms. The room had not fully recovered from the earlier incident. And now the same waitress everyone had overlooked had interrupted a conversation involving one of the largest acquisitions Whitmore Capital had attempted all year. Aaliyah immediately wished she had remained silent. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I should not have said anything." But the attorney was no longer interested in apologies. He reached for the document she had glanced at. "What exactly did you mean?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Nearby conversations slowed. Ethan Whitmore noticed the gathering crowd and started moving toward the table. Victoria Sinclair followed a few steps behind, more curious than concerned. Aaliyah hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away. Yet another part of her knew what she had seen. "The projected asset transfer schedule is tied to the preliminary valuation model," she said carefully. "But the discussion appears to be using the revised valuation figures." Silence followed. One executive frowned. Another quickly flipped through several pages. The attorney's expression changed. Then he flipped another page. And another. Suddenly his confidence began to crack. "That cannot be right," one executive muttered. But his voice lacked certainty. The group leaned closer to the documents. Pens moved. Calculators appeared. Pages turned faster. Ethan arrived just in time to watch the atmosphere shift. The tension around the table felt different now. Focused. Urgent. Real. Within moments, one of the financial analysts looked up from the paperwork. His face had lost color. "Wait a second," he whispered. He checked the numbers again. Then again. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were paper moving and distant music continuing somewhere across the ballroom. Finally, the analyst exhaled slowly. "She is right." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread instantly. Another executive grabbed the file. A third checked the digital projections on a tablet. The result was always the same. The wrong valuation model had been attached to the transfer schedule. If nobody had caught it, the mistake could have delayed the transaction for months and exposed the company to significant financial risk. Nobody knew exactly how much, but everyone understood it would have been expensive. Very expensive. Ethan looked directly at Aaliyah. "How did you catch that?" he asked. She shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. "I only noticed a few figures," she replied. The numbers did not seem consistent with the conversation. Several executives stared at her as though she had suddenly started speaking another language. Victoria folded her arms. Her smile disappeared. She did not like the direction of the conversation. Moments earlier, Aaliyah had been invisible. Now some of the most powerful people in the room were listening to every word she said. The attorney closed the folder slowly. "You may have just saved us from a major problem," he admitted. Around the table, heads nodded in reluctant agreement. And for the third time that night, the room found itself looking at Aaliyah Brooks in a completely different way. But deep inside, Ethan sensed this was only the beginning, because nobody acquires that kind of knowledge by accident. And the more he looked at her, the more certain he became that Aaliyah was hiding a past far more remarkable than anyone had imagined. The energy inside the ballroom had shifted so completely that it almost felt like a different event. An hour earlier, Aaliyah Brooks had been moving quietly between tables, unnoticed by nearly everyone around her. Now conversations stopped when she walked past. Investors glanced in her direction. Executives whispered among themselves. Even members of the hotel staff looked at her differently. Yet Aaliyah wanted none of the attention. She returned to work as though nothing had happened, clearing plates and refilling glasses while trying to ignore the curious eyes following her across the room. But attention, once earned, rarely disappears. Ethan Whitmore found himself watching her again, not because of what she had done, but because of what she refused to do. She was not seeking recognition. She was not telling anyone about the mistake she had caught. She was not trying to impress the executives who were now discussing her in hushed tones. She simply continued doing her job. That made her more interesting than any person in the room. Near the acquisition table, the attorneys were still reviewing documents. What had begun as a simple verification process had evolved into a deeper investigation. The more they examined the paperwork, the more inconsistencies they found. Deadlines were mismatched. Supporting figures contained errors. Several assumptions used in the financial projections were based on outdated market data. One executive rubbed his forehead and sighed. "How did nobody catch this?" he asked. Nobody had an answer. Then another voice spoke. "Because everyone was looking at the summary pages." The group turned. Aaliyah stood nearby holding a silver tray. She immediately regretted speaking. But Ethan noticed something important. She was not guessing. She sounded certain. The lead attorney narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Aaliyah hesitated. Every instinct told her to remain silent. Yet the problem sitting on that table was obvious to her now. "Most people trust executive summaries," she explained. "But summaries only reflect the assumptions underneath them. If the assumptions are wrong, the conclusions will be wrong too." Silence followed. Several executives exchanged looks. One analyst quickly opened additional files on his tablet. Minutes passed. Numbers were checked. References were reviewed. Then another discovery surfaced. A key growth assumption had been overstated. Not intentionally, just carelessly. The room grew quieter. A problem that seemed manageable 15 minutes earlier was becoming something much larger. Ethan stepped closer. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Aaliyah lowered her eyes. "I used to study business and finance," she answered. The words sounded simple, yet they landed with unexpected weight. "Used to. Not currently. Not recently. Used to." Ethan sensed an entire story hidden inside those two words. Before he could ask another question, one of the analysts suddenly stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. Every head turned. "This changes everything," he said. The color had drained from his face. He pointed toward a section of the acquisition model displayed on the screen. "If these assumptions remain in the final agreement, The valuation is off by nearly $70 million. The room froze. $70 million. The number hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then slowly, every executive at the table looked toward the same person. Not the attorneys. Not the analysts. Not the investors. They looked at Aaliyah Brooks. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Sinclair realized that the woman she had dismissed so easily was becoming the most important person in the room. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The ballroom that had once echoed with laughter and celebration now felt more like a boardroom moments before a critical vote. The executives gathered around the table stared at the financial models displayed on screens and scattered across polished folders. $70 million. The figure continued to hang over the room like a storm cloud. Ethan Whitmore looked from the documents to Aaliyah Brooks and back again. He had spent his career surrounding himself with analysts, consultants, attorneys, and advisors. Some earned seven-figure salaries. Yet the person who had uncovered the most significant issue of the evening was a waitress carrying a silver tray. The realization was impossible to ignore. One senior analyst adjusted his glasses and leaned toward Aaliyah. "If you do not mind me asking, where exactly did you study finance?" Aaliyah hesitated. Attention made her uncomfortable. Recognition made her even more uncomfortable. "Northern Illinois University," she answered quietly. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One of them immediately recognized the program. It was respected, competitive, difficult. "You must have graduated near the top of your class to understand this material at this level," another executive remarked. Aaliyah lowered her eyes. "I did not finish." The response surprised everyone. Ethan noticed the brief shadow that crossed her face. There was history there. Pain. Sacrifice. The kind people carried silently for years. Before anyone could ask another question, the lead attorney cleared his throat. "There may be something else." His voice sounded unusually tense. He turned a monitor toward the group. The incorrect valuation model affected more than the transfer schedule. Fingers moved across keyboards. Additional files opened. Calculations updated in real time. The room grew quiet again. Then another number appeared. Several executives stared at the screen. One investor actually stepped closer to verify what he was seeing. The mistake was larger than anyone had realized. Had the acquisition proceeded under the original assumptions, the company would not only have overpaid significantly, but future performance projections would have been distorted for years. The consequences could have damaged shareholder confidence and triggered legal complications. Ethan exhaled slowly. His team had spent 6 months preparing this acquisition. 6 months. Yet within less than 20 minutes, Aaliyah had uncovered weaknesses that dozens of professionals had overlooked. Across the room, Victoria Sinclair watched the scene unfold with growing frustration. Earlier that evening, every conversation had revolved around her engagement. Every camera had followed her movements. Now nobody seemed interested in discussing centerpieces, wedding plans, or designer gowns. The attention had shifted completely. She could feel it happening. Worse, she could see Ethan listening to Aaliyah with genuine respect. Something inside Victoria tightened. Nearby guests had begun whispering again, but this time the whispers sounded different. They were no longer discussing what had happened earlier. They were discussing Aaliyah, the brilliant waitress, the woman who spotted the $70 million error, the woman who seemed to know more about the acquisition than some of the people negotiating it. Ethan finally looked directly at her. "I think there is far more to your story than you have told us," he said. Aaliyah offered a small smile. Not proud, not defensive, simply polite. "Everybody has a story, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan nodded slowly. The answer stayed with him, because deep down he knew she was right. And before this night was over, the entire ballroom was about to discover just how extraordinary her story truly was. Aaliyah Brooks had spent years making sure nobody asked questions. It was easier that way. Easier to smile, work hard, and let people assume whatever they wanted to assume. Most people saw a uniform and stopped looking deeper. Most people heard the word waitress and immediately decided how much a person was worth. That habit had followed her throughout adulthood. Tonight, however, the walls she had built around her story were beginning to crack. The executives remained gathered around the acquisition table, but the atmosphere had changed from skepticism to curiosity. They no longer viewed her as an outsider standing near an important conversation. They viewed her as someone who belonged in it. Ethan Whitmore could feel it too. The room was no longer focused on financial models alone. It was focused on understanding the woman who had uncovered what everyone else missed. One senior executive finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "Why did you leave school?" The ballroom seemed quieter after those words. Aaliyah looked down at the tray in her hands. For a moment, she considered giving a simple answer. Something polite, something brief. But she was tired of hiding. Not tired in the physical sense. Tired in the way people become tired after carrying the same weight for years. "My mother became sick," she said softly. Nobody interrupted. "The treatments were expensive. My father had already passed away. My younger brother was still a child. Someone had to keep everything together." The executives listened in silence. "I worked part-time at first, then full-time, then 2 jobs. Eventually school became impossible." She offered a small smile. "Life makes decisions for you sometimes." Ethan felt something shift inside him. He had heard countless stories about ambition, about success, about determination. But this was different. There was no self-promotion in her voice, no attempt to impress anyone, just truth. One of the investors quietly shook his head. "You gave up your future." Aaliyah looked at him and answered with a calm certainty that stunned the table. "No, sir. I protected my family." "Those are not the same thing." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Several people lowered their eyes. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair watched the conversation from a distance. Every minute that passed seemed to make Aaliyah more respected, more admired, more impossible to dismiss. Victoria hated that feeling. Meanwhile, one of the analysts had begun searching public records and university archives. At first, he did it out of curiosity. Then his expression changed. He turned his laptop toward Ethan. "You should see this." Ethan stepped closer. On the screen appeared an academic profile. Aaliyah Brooks, Dean's List, multiple merit scholarships, National Business Competition finalist, top-ranking student in financial analysis. Several awards followed beneath her name. Ethan stared at the screen. The room reacted the same way. The evidence was undeniable. She had not merely attended a strong program. She had excelled in it. Another executive leaned forward. "You were one of the highest-ranked students in your entire class." Aaliyah looked surprised that anyone had found the records. Then she simply nodded. No bragging. No explanation. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter she thought the world had forgotten. But the room had not forgotten now. In fact, for many people present, that discovery changed everything. Because they suddenly realized they were not looking at a waitress who happened to understand finance. They were looking at a brilliant mind whose path had been interrupted by sacrifice. And for the first time all evening, Ethan Whitmore began wondering whether fate had brought Aaliyah into that ballroom for a reason. The discovery spread through the ballroom faster than any announcement could have. Guests who had arrived expecting an elegant engagement celebration now found themselves discussing something entirely different. Small groups formed near tables and along marble walkways. Phones appeared. Names were searched. Public profiles were examined. The story of Aaliyah Brooks moved from whisper to whisper until it became impossible to ignore. Yet while her reputation was rising, someone else's was beginning to crack. Victoria Sinclair could feel it. For years she had carefully managed how people saw her. Graceful, sophisticated, untouchable. The perfect future wife for one of the most successful businessmen in America. Tonight, however, the image she depended upon was beginning to slip. It started with a few uncomfortable conversations. Then came the quiet observations. Several guests recalled moments from previous events. Comments she had made. Employees she had dismissed. Service workers she had treated as though they were invisible. Individually, the stories seemed small. Together, they painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Near one of the investor tables, a prominent businesswoman lowered her voice and spoke to a colleague. "I witnessed something similar at a charity event last year." Another guest nodded. "So did I." The pattern was emerging. Not because anyone wanted to attack Victoria, because people were finally comparing experiences. Across the ballroom, Ethan noticed it happening. The tone of conversations changed whenever Victoria approached. Smiles became strained. Responses became shorter. Respect, once given automatically, was quietly disappearing. Victoria sensed it too. She attempted to redirect attention toward the engagement celebration. She posed for photographs. She greeted guests. She laughed a little louder than usual. But the room no longer moved around her the way it had earlier that evening. Meanwhile, Aaliyah continued working. She did not participate in the conversations. She did not defend herself. She did not criticize Victoria. That decision only increased people's respect for her. Because while others discussed character, she demonstrated it. Ethan found himself comparing the two women without meaning to. One had spent the evening demanding recognition. The other had spent the evening avoiding it. One measured value through status. The other measured it through responsibility. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Then another unexpected moment arrived. A member of Ethan's executive team approached him carrying a tablet. "You should see this." Ethan glanced at the screen. Several guests had already posted about the evening online. Not details, not gossip, observations. They praised the waitress who had identified the acquisition errors. They admired her professionalism. They described her calm demeanor under pressure. The reactions were overwhelmingly positive. Ethan looked across the ballroom toward Aaliyah. She was helping an elderly guest find a seat near the dance floor. No cameras, no audience, no expectation of recognition, just kindness. Something about that image stayed with him. Victoria noticed where he was looking. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Not anger, not frustration, fear. Because she was beginning to realize something important. The room was no longer impressed by power alone. It was responding to character. And character was the one thing that could not be purchased, inherited, or staged. As the evening moved closer to its conclusion, a feeling settled over the ballroom. Quiet, unavoidable. The people gathered there had arrived believing they knew exactly who mattered. By the end of the night, they were no longer certain. And Ethan Whitmore was preparing to make a decision that would surprise every person in the room. The ballroom grew quiet once again, but this time the silence felt different. Earlier it had been filled with shock. Now it was filled with reflection. Ethan Whitmore stepped toward the center of the room and gently tapped a glass. Conversations faded. Guests turned. The musicians lowered their instruments. Hundreds of eyes followed him as he stood beneath the glow of the chandeliers. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked across the room toward Aaliyah Brooks. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, still holding a silver tray, still trying to avoid becoming the center of attention. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration," Ethan began. "And it still is. But not for the reasons I expected." The room listened carefully. Ethan was known for measured words. He did not speak publicly without purpose. "This evening, my team discovered an error that could have cost our company tens of millions of dollars. The person who identified that problem was not one of my executives, not one of my attorneys, not one of my consultants." He paused. Then he smiled slightly. It was Aaliyah Brooks. Heads turned toward her once again. Aaliyah looked uncomfortable. Several guests began applauding. Then more joined in. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. The sound rolled through the room like a wave. Aaliyah lowered her eyes, clearly overwhelmed. Yet what moved people most was not her intelligence. It was her humility. She never once demanded recognition. She never once tried to embarrass anyone. She simply helped when she saw a problem. Ethan waited for the applause to settle. Then he continued. "There is something else I would like to say." His voice grew quieter, more personal. Success has taught me many lessons. Tonight taught me another. Talent does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Wisdom does not always sit at the head of the table. And character cannot be measured by a title. The room fell completely silent. Everyone understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Ethan looked directly at Aaliyah. On behalf of myself and my company, I owe you my gratitude. And I owe you my respect. Aaliyah smiled gently. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No attempt to prove a point. Just grace. Ethan then made an offer that surprised everyone. He invited her to meet with his executive team the following week to discuss opportunities within Whitmore Capital. Gasps moved through the crowd. Some investors smiled. Others nodded approvingly. The offer was not charity. Everyone in the room understood that. It was recognition of ability. Recognition that had been earned. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair stood quietly. For perhaps the first time that evening, she said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. The night had revealed something money could not purchase and status could not imitate. It had revealed character. As guests slowly began leaving the ballroom, conversations continued long into the evening. Yet nobody talked about the decorations. Nobody talked about the menu. Nobody talked about the engagement celebration. They talked about Aaliyah Brooks, the young woman who had arrived invisible and left unforgettable. And years later, those who attended would remember one simple truth from that night. Power may command attention. Wealth may command influence. But dignity commands respect. And in the end, respect was the one thing that mattered most.